So in history and in society, we know that anti-Semitism is always the first sign of societies falling apart, of profound problems within our society. And I think that this is what we are seeing today. I think we are going through a very profound crisis in our liberal democracies. We are seeing polarization, we are seeing radicalization, we are seeing Islamist extremism, we are seeing political extremism on the left, political extremism on the right. And Jews are always the first ones. Jews are the ones historically that, I said early on, anti-Semitism, I think, is a conspiracy theory. If things don't go well, if a society is unhappy, what better way to find than this tiny, tiny little minority that people have believed for centuries to be controlling the world? The difference between racism and anti-Semitism is that racism, people believe that the visible people are below, are not worthy, are inferior. With anti-Semitism, it's exactly the opposite. Is people believe that Jews are above and that they are controlling things and that they are at a place where they shouldn't be, should be my place. So it's just a reinvention of exactly that idea. And at a time when societies have forgotten that what they should be defending is liberal democracy, that the world order that we created since the Second World War is worth fighting for. Young people have forgotten that, it's not normal to be able to, you come from a place where it's not normal to be able to vote, and it's not normal to able to have liberties and freedom, and it's not able to, you don't have the right to have, your sexuality or your freedom of expression, and people have forgotten that. And so I think it's societies are falling apart. Our liberal democracies are falling apart, and in that, anti-Semitism is playing its first role. And we have seen it in France, I think, for the past 2 decades. It really started very early years, in the early years of 2000, where several things coincided. 9/11, the increase of Islamist extremism, including, of course, here in France. I mean, when we look back, we had people celebrating 9/11 here in France. We had the Second Intifada, and the issue of the importation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the identification with certain people from immigrant communities with the Palestinian cause, romanticizing something that had nothing to do with reality. People who came themselves from a colonial background and projected their own understanding of what colonialism is onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the third thing, I think, the falling apart of universalism, which we saw in particular with the Durban II conference that happened a few days before 9/11. Very interesting, actually. And which was supposed to be a conference against racism, and that turned itself into a hate festival against Zionism, Israel, and the Jews. So I think all of that was the beginning of that. And in France specifically, all of this counted a lot because France was the biggest Jewish community in Europe. France was the biggest Muslim community in Europe. And France has a colonial past. France has a Holocaust past. And all of that, I think, came together. And I think we are seeing 20 years later the consequence of everything that we have not dealt with 20 years ago. But now it's everywhere. And maybe to some extent, I'd say it's probably even worse elsewhere than it is in France.
One of the observations that I had, and I also read about this a lot from studies, surveys, the demography of the surge of anti-Semitism. Are we talking about an older generation or really very young generation? I mean, how did this happen? When did they learn anti-Semitism?
So here in France we have both. First of all, we have surveys say that we have, I'd say, three forms of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism that is traditional, old-style anti-Semitism, that is more enshrined in older generation, but not only, that I would say comes from the far right. And then we have anti-Semitism that comes from within the Muslim communities here in France, and anti-Semitism that comes from within the far left. Generally, by the way, when you look at opinion polls on anti-Semitism generally, the situation hasn't worsened in the general population. When you look at opinion polls that were done back in the 60s and 70s compared to today, it's actually slightly lower in the general population than it was back then. But you have these pockets of anti-Semitism that are very strong in these three communities, and in the second and third pocket, meaning the far left and the Muslim community, it is a little bit of a generational thing, but not only. You can see it definitely amongst young people who have a lack of understanding of what's going on in the Middle East, who have a lack of an understanding of what's going on in history, of history, who are obviously hugely influenced by social media and by the algorithms and by parallel realities. But it's not only a generational issue. Actually, we'll have to dig a little bit deeper, but one of the things that we found in our last survey that we did specifically on the Muslim community was that, and it was counterintuitive because it's not what we would have expected, but on a number of key questions, the level of anti-Semitic stereotypes was actually lower amongst young people than amongst older people. So we'll have to see whether that we are preparing now. We're in the middle of the preparation of our new survey of anti-Semitism that will be released in a couple of months. So we'll have to see whether that is confirmed. But it was the first time to see that within the Muslim community that it was the factor was not age. The factor within the Muslim community was the level of practice of religion. Now, there's also several interpretations. What does it mean, the level of practice? Is it the level of belief or the level or what people are hearing in mosques? The encounters people have when they go and practice their religion in the mosque. So that's an issue of radicalization more than anything else. But that is the determining factor within the Muslim community, is the level of practice of Islam. Is the determining factor. The big problem we definitely have are young people in terms of the understanding of history. I mean, we know it now. There have been numerous surveys. Is that the young people have less and less an understanding of what happened in the Holocaust. They don't know the number of people who were killed. They don't know when it took place. I mean, they people go through school, and here it's mandatory in France to learn about the Holocaust. But something is not going well because there's definitely a lack of understanding of history.
I mean, you really mentioned very important information, whether the background or the current rise. But this requires a governmental response as well. What is the government of France is doing about this?
So first of all, let me go a little bit back. 20 years ago, when anti-Semitism started here in France, and it was really an explosion, because when you look at the we spoke about the numbers now, but when you look at the numbers in the 1990s, you would have a few dozen anti-Semitic acts a year. So very, very low, 86, 87, 88 anti-Semitic acts a year. You go to the year of 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, it really exploded.